Ursula's return is here, and with it, 2 new starter decks. Today we're going to look at Stand Together, which is a Steel Sapphire deck. This deck wants to go wide with lots of low-cost characters.
But those characters all work together in interesting ways. This deck is all about synergies, asking your characters to work together to accomplish big things. So how does this deck work, and can it take you from 0 to hero? Let's take a look.
To talk about this deck, we need to talk about 3 major things: cheap characters, lack of card draw, and synergies. To get us started, let's talk about cheap characters.
This deck has many low-cost characters, with only 14 cards that cost 4 or more. This means that you'll be able to play lots in the early game, sometimes 2 cards per turn.
But that could be a problem with the deck's card draw, or lack thereof it. With only 1 true card draw, dig a little deeper at an 8 cost.
There's also Mickey Mouse Detective, whose ramp ability kind of serves as card draw, and we'll talk about that later. But when you combine those cheap characters with lack of card draw, it means that you can be going through your hand very quickly, leaving you top decking before you know it. What that means is you have to be very, very efficient with the characters that you're able to get on the board. And in this deck, you do that in one specific way: through synergies.
And that brings us to our last theme. This deck's characters are designed to help each other. There are some very specific combos like Rapunzel and Pascal. There are plenty of characters with support abilities, but one major theme running through this deck is the hero synergy.
There are 38 heroes in this deck, and plenty of cards to help your heroes get stronger, allowing you to outvalue your opponents. Every time you can trade a cheaper character for a more expensive character, or even better, trade 2 for 1, that's just great.
On turn 1, you have 2 plays: Robin Hood Beloved Outlaw, which is a 2/2 with 1 lore, and Aladdin, a 1/3 with 1 lore.
Now these are both vanilla cards, and they're fine plays. With only 3 copies of each in the deck though, you won't always have a turn 1 play, and that's fine, although I think this deck is better when you do. Out of the 2 options that you have, I think Aladdin is the better one. It has more willpower, and there's plenty of cards which allow you to buff your character's strength, so having that extra willpower is extra nice.
Now let's take a look at turn 2 characters, where your options really open up with 6 different characters available. First up is Basil of Baker Street, a 2/2 with 1 lore, and support, which means that you can add his strength to another character when he quests.
Next up is Mickey Mouse Standard Bearer, a 1/3 with 1 lore, but when he's played, he gives one of your characters Challenger +2.
And then we have Kita, Royal Warrior, a 2/3 with 1 lore and Bodyguard, allowing you to protect your other characters.
Next up, we have a fun card, and that's Anna, Braving the Snow. Now, this card is a 1/4 with 1 lore, but her ability really highlights the theme of this deck, and that's hero synergy. If there's other heroes in play, she gets +1 lore, giving you a 2 lore character with 4 willpower on turn 2.
Aurora Tranquil Princess is a 1/3 with 1 lore, and she has Ward, making it impossible for an opponent to choose her.
Next up, it's another Aurora, and this is one we've seen before, Royal Princess from the first chapter. Now, she's a 2/2 with 2 lore, making her an aggressive play on turn 2.
So before we move on, I want to point out that every character we've covered thus far is a hero.
So many heroes.
And that theme continues at 3 Inc. First up is the quintessential Disney hero, Prince Philip, Gallant Defender. He is a 1/3 with 2 lore and support. And he has a second ability. When another character is chosen for support, they gain resist +1 this turn.
This is me with a sword and shield. Next up, it's another card we've seen before, and that's Mickey Mouse Detective. Now, Mickey Mouse is a 1/3 uninkable that helps you ramp. And by that I mean when you play him, you get to put the top card of your deck into your inkwell face down. And you can think of this ability as sort of card draw, because every ink you get in your inkwell that's not from your hand leaves you 1 more card that you can play.
Next up is Ariel Determined Mermaid, which is a 2/4 with 1 lore. She has the ability that allows you to draw a card and discard a card when you play a song, which is really helpful in this deck. However, with only 5 songs in the deck, you won't be using this ability very often.
So Aaron, we're about to talk about our first non-hero card in this deck, and it's an ally, Pascal Inquisitive Pet. Now Pascal is a 3/3 with 1 lore, and when you play him, you get to look at the top 3 cards of your deck and rearrange them in any order. But he's also super helpful with your 1 copy of Rapunzel, and we'll talk about that a little later.
The next up is Flounder, Collector's Companion. That's right, my friend, Flounder is back. He is a 2/2 with 2 lore and support. And if you have a character named Ariel in play, he costs 1 ink less. It is worth mentioning, however, that you only have Ariel Determined Mermaid in this deck with only 3 copies.
Next up is Ling, and he is a 3/3 with 1 lore, but he gives all of your heroes +1 strength. On to 4 cost characters.
At 4 lore, let's start with the deck's only super rare, Anna Truehearted.
Now in this deck, Anna is one of your bombs. She's a 2/4 with 2 lore, but when she quests, she gives each of your heroes +1 lore this turn. If you have a bunch of other heroes in play, this can close out games really quickly. The downside is there's only one copy of her in this deck, so don't count on seeing her too often. But when you do, it's very exciting.
Next at 4, you have Transformed Chef. He is a 3/3 with 2 lore, and when he comes into play, he removes 2 damage from one of your characters.
Next up, it's another bomb and awesome new card, Philatides No-Nonsense Instructor. First, he gives all of your heroes Challenger +1, making them all just a little bit stronger. And second, his Shameless Promoter ability gives you 1 lore each time you play a hero, so you can leave him on your board just ready and gaining 1 lore each turn as you play cards, no questing needed. Using him, you can close out games if the game goes on long enough. Now, this card will probably be pretty good even in Standard, so definitely a card to look out for in sealed events.
The last 4-cost card is Mulan, Armored Fighter. She's a vanilla 3/6 with 1 lore, but she is a hero.
She's a hero. At 5 cost, you have 2 characters, and the first one is Rapunzel, Apprentice Artist. Now, Rapunzel is a 3/5 with 3 lore, making her one of your closers. Now, what makes her extra good is if you have Pascal in play, she gains Ward, meaning your opponents can't choose her. Now, there are only 2 copies of Pascal in this deck, so don't count on getting this combo in play too often, but when you do, it's extra good.
Next up is Li Shang, Imperial Officer. He's a vanilla 5/5 hero with 2 lore. Your most expensive characters are going to cap out at 6, and at 6 you have 2 characters.
First up, you have 1 copy of Hercules, Beloved Hero. Now, Hercules is a 6/5 with Bodyguard, a pretty common ability for Hercules cards, and he also has Resist 1, making him challenging to take down.
Lastly is 2 copies of Sisu, Wise Friend. She's a vanilla 6/6 with 2 lore. She requires a lot to take down, so getting her on the board is always good.
Alright, that's it for characters, but we have a few other cards that we need to look at, and let's start by looking at your only location in this deck, Thebes. Thebes is a 7 willpower location with a 1 move cost, and it's a good thing Thebes is fairly cheap to move characters to because Thebes has a killer ability. When one of your characters there banishes another character in a challenge, you gain 2 lore. And only costing 2, I mean, Thebes is pretty cheap to get on the board.
Let's talk a moment about how to play Thebes. In general, you won't actually want to play this card on turn 2. You will want to spend your early game building your board with cheap heroes.
That's right. Thebes is best played as a later turn ambush card. And by that I mean you'll want to play Thebes, immediately move 2 or 3 characters there, and then challenge characters that your opponent has left vulnerable, allowing you to swing the board state while also gaining lore in the process.
There are 3 copies of Thebes in this deck, so you're likely to see it every game. If you can save it until late game and move some strong characters there immediately, you can really swing the game in your favor and make your opponent make some difficult decisions.
Next up, it's your deck's only item, Imperial Bow. Now, by paying 1 ink and exerting this item, you can give one of your characters Challenger +2 and Evasive for a turn. And you may have noticed that you have no evasive characters in this deck, so this is your one option to allow you to use challenges to remove an opponent's evasive characters.
But don't worry, you do have some targeted removal in this deck. Let's talk about your actions. Smash is a 3-cost action that does 3 damage to a chosen character, and you have 2 copies in this deck.
Next, it's 1 copy of One Last Hope, a new 3-cost uninkable song that gives one of your characters Resist +2 until the start of your next turn. But if it's a hero, which you have 38 of in this deck, that character can challenge ready characters this turn, allowing you to banish a character that your opponent thought was safe.
Making challenging a little less intimidating are 2 copies of a new song, Seldom All They Seem. This card gives one of your opponent's characters -3 strength this turn.
And with a final card in this deck, we finally reached your card draw. This is a new song called Dig a Little Deeper that costs 8, and it has a new mechanic called Sing Together. Now, this mechanic allows your characters to band together to sing songs, like a chorus, as long as the cost of those characters adds up to the cost of the song, in this case 8. Now, this is super expensive, but this card draw is super good. It allows you to look at the top 7 cards of your deck to pick 2 to put in your hand before putting the rest on the bottom of your library. Now, one thing I will note is this card is uninkable, meaning that if you get it in your hand early game, you're going to be waiting a while for you to play it, and it might be a dead card unless you have 8 ink or 8 characters on the table. So something to keep in mind.
Many of the characters are designed to make other characters better through specific synergies, like Pascal and Rapunzel, abilities like support and hero synergy.
With this deck, the more characters that you have on the board, the better. And so playing aggressively and leaving your characters vulnerable isn't necessarily the best way to go. There are a couple aggressive lines, but the best one, and probably the only one that I would recommend playing, involves leveraging Anna Truehearted on turn 4. It involves playing a character on turn 1, a 2-lore character on turn 2, preferably Anna surviving the storm, on turn 3 a 2-lore character like Prince Philip, and then on turn 4 playing Anna Truehearted. Now on turn 5, this allows you to quest with Anna for 2, and then give +1 lore to the other heroes that you've played, meaning you have 2 lore, 3 lore, 3 lore, 2 lore. That's 10 lore in one turn in addition to whatever else you've quested for prior to that, on turn 5. So using this line, you can have maybe 12 or 14 lore by the time you start turn 6, which is pretty good. But if you don't have Anna Truehearted, I would argue that an aggressive line isn't necessarily the way to go with this deck.
But rather than aggro, this deck is better suited for board control. But remember, if you're challenging your opponent's characters, be careful not to lose too many too early in the game. To be honest, in a sealed event, this deck may work best if you just spend your first 3 to 4 turns building up your board state, giving you more tools to allow for better trades as the game moves on.
And there's one more benefit to maintaining a big board state that I want to talk about. Do you remember Dig a Little Deeper? That song costs 8 ink, and it's uninkable. And in general, you don't want to have 8 ink on the board in this deck. Remember that your most expensive characters cost 6, so in general, you want to sing Dig a Little Deeper. Having characters on the board that cost 8 or more allow you to play this card without having to ink too many unnecessary cards. Every unnecessary card that you ink is one less card you have to play.
So usually we give you more openings than the aggressive opening, but we're not going to do that because there are just so many options.
This starter deck, like most starter decks, has a ton of variance, meaning there's a lot of 1 of and 2 of cards in this deck, meaning every game is going to be different. To put it in perspective, most meta decks or standard build decks have about 20 or less different cards. This starter deck has 28.
In general, the key to a good opening with this deck is to play a character on curve every turn for your first 4 to 5 turns. When you're making your mulligan choices, make sure you keep that in mind.
And lastly, remember your bombs. Anna Truehearted and Philatides are 1-ofs in this deck, and they're cards that you always want to play, so if you see them in your opening hand, always keep them. When you play Philatides, consider leaving him ready for as long as you can, allowing you to make use of his passive abilities, especially the one that gives you lore every time you play a hero.
The next 1-of to look out for is Rapunzel Apprentice Artist, which serves as one of your finishers with 3 lore. If you're able to protect her, she can close out games quickly.
And speaking of protection, the last bomb we want to remind you of is Hercules. With his bodyguard and resist, he can keep your opponent's characters at bay long enough to allow your suite of heroes to win you the game.
So that's it. To summarize, remember these 4 things.
1. Build a big board state. Many of the characters in this deck are designed to help other characters. Your heroes just get better over time, so don't sacrifice them needlessly.
2. Be efficient. There's little card draw, so make smart trades and limit your inking to 6.
3. This may sound silly, but remember that Dig a Little Deeper is in your deck. It's 8 cost, it's uninkable, so usually it's a dead card unless you have 8 cost worth of characters on board to sing it. The last thing you want is to draw it late game and not be able to play it.
And 4, remember the bombs. These are normally 1-ofs, so if you have them, try to hold on to them and ink them sparingly.
So what do you think of this deck? What questions do you have? Are you excited to play it? Let us know in the comments below, and please consider liking and subscribing. Until next time, happy questing.